Right. Welcome to the next installment of our Knowledge Mobilization Flash Talk series. We are joined today by Dr. Percival Matthews, who is Associate Professor in Educational Psychology and a partner in a whole lot of different knowledge mobilization work with DPI. So really to have him here today. Also want to thank our partners. We are an effort of Wisconsin Center for Education Research and the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction with support from the U.S. Department of Education. So with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Matthews. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, everybody. So 5 minutes, right? I teach in educational, I'm a researcher in educational psychology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And today I'll talk to you a little bit about some of my thinking about mobilizing math education research, some of the places that I'm trying to go, some ideas that hopefully people will find interesting that we can springboard off of and help each other out with. So if you go to the next slide, Annalie. So when we look at knowledge mobilization, when it comes to research in general math education, we have this two cultures problem, and this is one of the things that, whether it's Nathan Kaplan back in 1979, where he talked about researchers versus policymakers, or some more recent things where we talk about researchers and teachers, or researchers and practitioners. There are these two communities, these two cultures that don't always interact as vigorously as we would like. So the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics found that math education research is often not considered in practice. And then, researcher agendas are seldom informed by mathematics educators, which is really a problem because these mathematics educators are a rich source of knowledge. They have knowledge of the practice, knowledge of the locales, and knowledge of things. So we really need to get this knowledge going both ways. And this has been a long-standing problem. So NCTM, Journal for Research in Mathematics Education, has talked about this over and over again for a while. And one of the more recent people to take up was the latest editorial staff of JRME. And if you switch the page, so Jim Fakai's staff, they put together this vision over the course of basically 4 years, where there were a series of editorials that they put out in the flagship journal for NCTM, which is the Journal for Research in Math Education, where they had this future vision for bridging research and practice. And in this future, they have Mr. Love Math, this teacher who's likes math, is really wanting to help kids out, and Miss Research, who's this researcher, and what kinds of collaboration, what kinds of cooperations, co-inquiry they were engaged in. And they thought about what kind of infrastructure we would need to facilitate something like that, some sort of knowledge sharing like this. And so there were 3 kinds of infrastructure that they needed, that they said we needed, that jumped out at me. And one was a way to reconceptualize the roles of teachers and researchers. We can count this as intellectual infrastructure. So new technologies to help support this shift, and we can think about that as technological infrastructure. And then new incentives, incentivizing infrastructure to sort of drive this shift. And if you change the page, one of the things that struck me about it was they thought about this as future infrastructure, or a vision of the future. And I stopped, and it was like, well, the only place where I really started to disagree with them was about how much we needed to wait into the future for this infrastructure to be here. And so I started to ask, to what extent is part of that future now, if we stop and think about what is already here that we can redeploy? And so one, from the intellectual side, is this knowledge mobilization framework. And early on in the series, Annalise shared something from Vivian Singh at WT Grant, and it talked about knowledge mobilization in terms of thinking about producer push, or researchers' efforts to share knowledge in various forms, user pull, or these non-academic efforts to seek information, and then this co-production. And one of the things that's easy to happen when you first look at this is it looks like the push comes from researchers out to teachers. And one of the things that we're trying to do with this reconceptualization, if you go to the next slide, is to really focus on how bidirectional this is. Teachers hold and produce lots of knowledge. A lot of the things they do in the classroom every day, it's empirical, it's research. A lot of it can be research, even if it's more informal. And a lot of what researchers at the university tend to do is seek information. So there's a pull and a push that can go from both ways. And if we're going to have real co-production, the question is, how do we facilitate an environment in which people actually do share information, where it's not hierarchical so much, and so that there is a real sort of co-development of knowledge? So we want to reframe where teachers are knowledge producers and researchers are also information seekers. And one of the things that the knowledge mobilization framework does, which is popular in Canada, a few universities, popular in different parts of the UK, Vivian Singh and W.T. Grant, and a couple of people are trying to get popular here, is it gives us a way to reconceptualize what we do. And if we think about us all as practitioners, teachers as practitioners, researchers as practitioners, where there is a practice to what we do so that we see ourselves as a group and think about what the commonalities are, we can think about how these different practices can learn from and inform each other. And so what you need is some place to sort of let this infrastructure live and be deployed. And if you go to the next slide, it's a technological infrastructure. So one of the things that JIMFA was wondering, that Kai team was wanting, was a big, database that was searchable with different artifacts and ways to communicate. And when they sat down with the technical team, they realized the tech team just asked what they wanted. And it came down a lot to our imaginations. The tech team can do whatever you want for that. Oh, I'm out of time. So social media does a lot. So if we do things like Facebook, there's a thing called WiseLearn that we have through DPI, but there are ways where if we can use this existing technology, these places where people already go, that are democratizing, that are networked, that can lead to this sort of data sharing, I think it's really important. And the last slide was just about incentives. So I'll really quickly tell you, on the right, there was this teacher who contacted me after seeing one of my articles. And when I talked to this guy, he collected a whole lot of data and we wrote this article together. And so this is something that is incentivized for professors as far as like new data, actual publications, things to build your CV, knowledge sharing, incentivized for teachers, or here's some place where you can talk about specific items, specific problems with people throughout the state or throughout the nation, because the internet allows you to do that at all kinds of times of the day and night at all kinds of speed. And the question marks at the end are just, let's think about how we can use this, which takes us into our conversation, which is motivated by a question like this. How can we redeploy existing infrastructure to facilitate these bi-directional paths of communication? I put this pretty little crazy thing, right, this coronavirus, because one of the things that it did was it forced us into lots of Zoom meetings like this. And I communicate and collaborate with people who I didn't before. My undergraduates can participate in my research program actively from 1,000 miles away now, partially because this thing made it necessary. So this is a really good reflexive point for us to stop and think, what existing our infrastructure is there, can we redeploy with a little imagination?